I was watering the ferns on my front porch when my son dropped an empty moving box at my feet. It was a quiet Tuesday. The neighborhood was completely still, the kind of morning where you can hear the sprinkler clicking 3 houses down. David didn't greet me. He didn't ask about my arthritis or how I was sleeping since his father passed 2 years ago. He just dropped the cardboard on the welcome mat, folded his arms, and looked at me with a practiced, patient expression. His wife, Sarah, walked right past me into my hallway. She didn't even make eye contact. She simply carried a clipboard, her heels clicking aggressively against my hardwood floors. David cleared his throat, adjusting his jacket. "Mom, we need to talk about the timeline. You have 2 weeks to pack. We've already found a nice, quiet senior apartment for you across town." I slowly lowered my watering can. I didn't drop it in shock. I didn't gasp. I just watched a drop of water slide down a green leaf and sink into the soil. Inside the house, I could hear Sarah opening my kitchen cabinets. "These old plates have to go," she called out, her voice echoing in the space my husband and I had built over 40 years. "Leo needs the lower shelves for his snacks." "Did you hear me, Mom?" David asked, his tone dipping into that condescending register people reserve for toddlers and the elderly. I looked at my 35-year-old son, the boy I had driven to soccer practice, the man whose college loans I had quietly paid off. He stood on my porch trying to evict me from my own life. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. "I heard you, David." I replied, my voice perfectly level. I picked up the empty moving box, folded it flat with a sharp snap, and thought about the thick manila envelope resting in my bedroom safe. They had no idea what was coming. The disrespect hadn't started with the moving box. It had been creeping into my home like water seeping under a doorframe, quiet and destructive. It started 3 months ago when Sarah decided my living room was the perfect free daycare. They would drop 5-year-old Leo off on Friday evenings, offering no explanation other than a breezy, "We have dinner plans, don't wait up." They treated my time as if it had no value, assuming a widow of 68 had nothing better to do than serve their schedule. Then came the financial assumptions. I noticed my pantry emptying faster. David would swing by on Sunday afternoons and walk out with grocery bags full of my expensive coffee steaks and paper goods. "Just grabbing a few things, Mom," he would throw over his shoulder. I never received a thank you. I was simply a resource to be mined. But the real line was crossed the day before the moving box arrived. I was wiping down the kitchen counters after they had finally picked Leo up. I reached for my keychain on the wooden hook by the back door. My spare house key, the brass one with the square head, was missing. I checked the floor. I checked my purse. I knew exactly where it had gone. Sarah had stood by that hook for 10 minutes waiting for David to start the car. They hadn't asked for a key. They had simply taken it, believing this house was already theirs. They saw me as an obstacle, an old piece of furniture that needed to be cleared out so they could take over. I didn't call them to argue. Arguing gives people the illusion that a negotiation is taking place. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed a local number. "Harry's Lock and Safe," a gruff voice answered. "Hello, Harry." I smiled, tracing the empty hook with my finger. "I need all the exterior locks on my house changed, today, if possible." The first boundary was about to be drawn. Harry finished the job by 2 in the afternoon. The new locks were heavy, solid brass. When I turned the deadbolt, it made a deep, satisfying thud that echoed through the empty hallway. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, sat in my favorite armchair by the front window, and opened a book. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:30, Sarah's silver SUV pulled into my driveway. She marched up the front walk holding a tape measure and a notebook. She didn't bother to knock. I watched through the sheer curtains as she slid the stolen brass key into the lock. She turned it. Nothing happened. She jiggled the handle, frowning, and tried again. She pushed her shoulder against the wood, her face flushing red with frustration. Finally, she pounded her fist against the door. I took a slow sip of my tea. I set the cup down, smoothed my cardigan, and walked to the door. I pulled it open just a few inches, leaving the heavy chain engaged. "The key isn't working," Sarah snapped, entirely skipping a greeting. "Open the door, Nora. I need to measure the guest room for Leo's bed." "You don't need to measure anything, Sarah," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. "Because you are not moving in." Her jaw dropped slightly. "David already told you. David does not own this property." I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "I do. And my spare key is not yours to take. If you ever steal from my home again, you won't be allowed on the porch." She stared at me breathless, her entitlement momentarily short-circuiting. "You're being completely unreasonable. We are family." "Family asks," I corrected her. "Thieves take." I closed the door gently until it clicked shut, sliding the deadbolt into place. Outside, I heard her stomping back to her car, her phone already pressed to her ear. I knew David would be calling within minutes. Let him call. I had plenty of time. As my phone began to buzz on the kitchen counter, vibrating violently against the granite, I ignored it. I walked slowly up the carpeted stairs to my bedroom. I knelt in front of the small fireproof safe I kept tucked behind my winter sweaters in the closet. I spun the dial, feeling the familiar mechanical clicks under my fingers. Inside sat my marriage certificate. My husband's life insurance documents, the deed to the house completely paid off, and a plain, white envelope. I pulled the envelope out and ran my thumb over the seal. The story behind this piece of paper started 6 months ago. Leo had fallen off the monkey bars at school and needed a minor procedure at the emergency room. I had been the one to take him because David and Sarah were unreachable at a winery. During the intake, the nurse ran routine blood work. When she updated his chart, she casually mentioned Leo's blood type. O negative. I had paused. I knew for a fact that David was AB positive. My husband and I had the same rare type, and we had thoroughly discussed it when David was born. Sarah. I remembered from a conversation about blood donation, was A positive. An AB positive father and an A positive mother cannot produce an O negative child. It is biologically impossible. I hadn't caused a scene in the hospital. I hadn't confronted Sarah. Instead, a week later, I ordered a discreet direct-to-consumer DNA relationship kit. I swabbed the inside of David's cheek under the guise of an ancestry project I was doing, and I took a swab from Leo's toothbrush. When the results arrived in the mail, I opened them alone at my kitchen table. The paper confirmed what the blood types had suggested. Probability of paternity 0.00%. I had placed the report in the safe. I had intended to let David live his life believing the truth would only break his heart. But now they were trying to break my life. I slid the envelope under my pillow. The rules of the game had just changed. David didn't just call. He left 3 frantic voicemails. I deleted them without listening. I didn't need to hear a grown man throw a temper tantrum. Instead, I carried my laptop to the kitchen table and logged into my bank accounts. When my husband died, I had added David as an authorized user on my secondary credit card and a joint emergency savings account. It was meant for absolute catastrophes, a medical bill, a sudden car failure. I pulled up the transaction history. Over the last 4 months, the emergencies had become remarkably frequent. A $200 charge at an upscale steakhouse, $400 at a designer boutique, a weekend stay at a boutique hotel. David and Sarah were funding their lifestyle on my dime while simultaneously planning to kick me out of my home. I clicked on the account management tab. Remove authorized user. A prompt asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. Next, I transferred the entire balance of the joint savings account into my primary private account. The joint balance immediately dropped to zero. It took exactly 45 minutes for the consequence to land. My phone rang. This time, I answered. Mom! David's voice was high and tight, completely stripped of his usual arrogance. My card just got declined at the mechanic, and the savings account is empty. Did you get hacked? No, David. I stirred my tea, watching the steam rise. I didn't get hacked. Then what happened to the money? My money, I corrected gently. It's secured in my personal account. Since you and Sarah are financially stable enough to manage a new household, I realized you no longer need my emergency funds to buy premium steak and hotel rooms. Dead silence on the line. You cut me off, he finally whispered. I updated my finances, I replied. You should probably figure out how to pay that mechanic. I hung up. The financial cord was officially cut. If they wanted a war for my resources, they were going to fight it with empty pockets. The weekend arrived with heavy rain drumming a steady rhythm against the living room windows. I was reading the morning paper when I saw their car pull into the driveway. They didn't bother trying the front door this time. David rang the doorbell repeatedly, keeping his finger pressed against the plastic until it became a continuous, obnoxious drone. I walked to the door, unlocked the new deadbolt, and opened it. David stood on the porch, his jacket soaked his face tight with anger. Sarah stood behind him, her arms crossed tight over her chest, holding a large plastic bin. They pushed past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. We need to get this sorted right now, David demanded, shaking water off his coat onto my clean rug. You changed the locks, you cut off the accounts, and you won't answer my calls. What is wrong with you, Mom? I closed the front door quietly. Take your shoes off, David. You're tracking mud. He blinked, thrown off by my complete lack of emotion. He kicked his shoes off aggressively. Sarah dropped the plastic bin onto the floor with a loud crack. I brought boxes, Sarah announced, glaring at me. Because apparently you haven't started packing. Leo's preschool starts next month and we need this house ready. We can't afford our current rent and a new mortgage. Then you should look for a cheaper apartment. I suggested walking into the kitchen and taking a seat at my table. I gestured for them to stand. David followed me, leaning heavily against the counter. Mom, you're not listening. You are 68. This house is too big for you to maintain. You're being entirely selfish. We are your family. We need this space. You want the space, I corrected. You want the asset. You want the free ride. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. You have no idea what it takes to raise a child right now. You are holding us back. I looked at Sarah. I looked at the sheer entitlement masking her panic. They were out of money, out of patience, and out of luck. Finish your thought, David, I said calmly. Say exactly what you came here to say. David stood up straight, inflating his chest. He looked around my kitchen at the oak cabinets his father had built at the tile floor I had scrubbed for decades, and he looked at me not as a mother, but as a squatter in his territory. Make room for your grandson's family. He ordered, his voice echoing in the quiet house. He pointed a finger toward the front door. Pack your things and leave by Friday. If you don't, I'll start hiring movers to box up this place myself. Sarah smirked, a small, victorious lifting of her lip. She thought she had won. She thought the sheer force of their united disrespect would finally break my spirit, the way they had worn down every other boundary over the years. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I didn't remind him of the nights I stayed up when he had a fever or the sacrifices his father made to leave this house debt-free. Guilt only works on people who have a conscience. I simply stood up from the table. "Wait right here," I said. I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I climbed the stairs, my hand gliding smoothly along the banister. The house was perfectly silent except for the rain against the roof. I walked into my bedroom, reached under my pillow, and pulled out the plain white envelope. It felt light in my hands, yet heavy enough to crush everything they had built. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I only felt a deep, profound clarity. I was excising an infection from my life. I walked back down the stairs. David was whispering furiously to Sarah in the kitchen. They stopped talking the moment my slippers touched the first floor tile. I walked into the kitchen and dropped the envelope flat on the wooden table. "What is this?" David sighed, rolling his eyes. "More bank statements." "No," I replied, pulling my chair out and sitting down. "It's the reason neither of you will be sleeping in this house tonight or any other night." David looked at the envelope, then at me, before reaching out and sliding his finger under the flap. Sarah shifted her weight nervously. "If this is some kind of legal threat, Nora, it won't work. We know our rights." "You have no rights here," I said softly. "Read it, David." He pulled out the folded sheet of paper. It was a standard laboratory report stamped with an official logo. His eyes scanned the top lines, reading the names. Then his gaze dropped to the bolded results at the bottom of the page. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the numbers. His shoulders dropped. His breath caught in his throat, making a sharp, choking sound. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Panic spread across his face, wide and undeniable. "What?" David stammered, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. "What is this? This is a joke." "It's a paternity test," I stated clearly. "I ran it 6 months ago after Leo's hospital visit revealed a blood type incompatibility." Sarah froze. The victorious smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute paralyzing terror. She reached for the paper. "Give me that." David yanked it away from her, stepping backward. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide with betrayal. "Probability of paternity, 0%. He read aloud, his voice cracking. "Sarah, what did you do?" "David, it's fake. She's lying to get rid of us." Sarah stammered, her voice pitching into a shrill, desperate whine. She reached for him again. "It's from an accredited lab, Sarah," I interjected smoothly. "You can run another one tomorrow if you'd like to waste the money. But we all know what it will say." David stared at the woman he had been ready to throw me out of my home for. The united front shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in the middle of my kitchen. "You told me to make room for my grandson's family." I looked directly at David. "That boy is not your son. And he is not my grandson. There is no family for me to make room for." "David, please." Sarah begged, tears suddenly spilling down her cheeks. "It was one mistake. It was years ago, before we were married. We were on a break. 5 years." David shouted, the paper crumpling in his fist. "You lied to me for 5 years. You made me pay for him. You made me demand my mother's house for him. I did it for us." She shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. "And she held on to this. She waited to ruin our lives." "You ruined your own life, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a cold blade. "I simply provided the documentation." David looked at me, a shattered, broken man. He looked like the little boy who used to scrape his knee and expect me to magically take the pain away. He took a step toward me, reaching out. "Mom, I didn't know." He wanted comfort. He wanted me to open my arms, tell him it would be okay, and let him move in so I could take care of him while his marriage imploded. I stayed seated. I didn't reach back. You didn't know about the biology, I said, holding his gaze. But you knew exactly what you were doing when you brought a moving box to my door. You knew what you were doing when you tried to bully a widow out of her own home. You chose to treat me like garbage, David. The DNA doesn't excuse your behavior. His hand dropped to his side. The realization hit him he hadn't just lost his wife and the child he thought was his. He had lost his safety net. Both of you, I stood up, gesturing toward the hallway. Get out of my house! Mom, please, I have nowhere to go. David pleaded, the arrogant son completely gone. You are 35, I replied, walking to the front door and opening it wide to the pouring rain. Figure it out. Sarah ran out first, sobbing into her hands. David stood in the hallway for a long moment looking at me. I didn't blink. Eventually, he lowered his head, stepped out into the rain, and walked to his car. I shut the heavy front door. I turned the brass deadbolt, hearing that satisfying final click. I engaged the chain. Through the front window, I watched them argue violently in the driveway, the rain soaking them to the bone. Sarah was screaming. David was shaking his head, refusing to get into the same car with her. Eventually, she sped off in the SUV, leaving him standing alone on the wet asphalt. He pulled out his phone, likely calling a friend or a cheap motel. I closed the blinds. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the crumpled moving box Sarah had dropped earlier, and tossed it into the recycling bin. I wiped down the counter where David had leaned, erasing the last physical trace of their entitlement from my space. Over the next few weeks, the silence in the house wasn't lonely. It was luxurious. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that David had filed for divorce. He texted me twice, asking for a loan to cover a deposit on a studio apartment. I read the messages, archived them, and went back to tending my garden. A mother's love is deep, but it is not a blank check to be cashed by disrespect. I had spent decades making myself smaller so David could feel big. I had offered my resources, my time, and my home only to be treated like an obstacle in my own life. I didn't need to yell, and I didn't need to sue anyone. I just needed to stop handing over the keys to my peace. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and walked out to the back patio. The sun was shining. The air was crisp. I sat down in my favorite chair entirely alone, and for the first time in years, I felt like I owned every single breath I took. My house, my rules, my life.